Hey everyone, Mario again, coming at you with another video. As you can tell from the title, I finally did manage to see the Richard Lester cut of Superman 2. Now, which order I'm going to put this video up in, I don't know. It's either going to be after the Richard Donner cut video is uploaded, or I might just wait and upload it last before Man of Steel. Depends on my mood and when I can get this thing fully edited. Now, first off, I have to say it was semi-difficult to be able to find a version of this because you guys know the only two I have are Superman 1 and then the Richard Donner cut, and it took a while to actually find AAVI of it. The first couple I found were Richard Donner cut, but they were unlabeled. It just said Superman 2. So when I finally get it, I'm like, okay, that sucks. I could not find it on VHD because I just typed in Superman 2 and everything but popped up. I did find one the other night, but it was a gig and a half of space, which that bothered me alone, but even more so when I found out, while it was the Lester cut, it was dubbed. You can imagine how frustrating that was, even more so because you can hear the English audio under it. It's like, oh. But luckily I managed to find a normal copy, and it was a Blu-ray quality, and it actually played on the PS3, so I was happy about that. So maybe I'll make a DVD-R of that copy and keep it, because I will say I like the Lester cut. I will say it's interesting, and it was interesting to actually watch this film, and then at the same time, because it's been a couple weeks since I watched Donner's cut, what I did was that I had the Donner cut in my computer. So what I would do was like scan. And one of the first things, scan through the Donner cut as I watched the Lester cut, and one of the first things I noticed is some scenes were edited differently and in different sequences, and of course different stuff like the openings and how Lois finds out that Clark is Superman, stuff like that. So it was an interesting experience. Now, like I said, I like the Lester cut, but I have to say I still overall prefer the Donner cut, and just seems to me like a better version. Now, if you prefer Lester's cut, that's fine, because I'm going to explain throughout this review why I prefer Donner's cut. Now, Lester's cut, I thought you guys all know my thoughts from my Donner cut video about how I feel about them kicking Donner off the set. I think it was a BS thing to do, and Donner's cut is probably the closest we're ever going to get to seeing what Donner wanted to do before he got kicked off. But anyway, with Lester's cut, first difference I noticed is since there's no Marlon Brando footage, they had to re-edit the Zod and his minions being kicked off of Krypton, which that didn't bother me because I understand why it was re-edited, but it's one of the things I prefer in Donner's cut because it just makes more sense. Another thing is the opening. It does do a lot of recap of the previous film, which both cuts do, but I prefer how it did in Donner for one reason. Because even though the whole Paris scene is interesting and it adds a scene between Superman and Lois, it just came off as unnecessary. And from what I understand, that's one of the scenes Lester shot. I think the movie opening with just a slight recap of events of the previous film, and then the nuke being thrown into space, and then destroying the Phantom Zone, that worked better. And also, just another thing I want to mention is that the Donner cut's actually a little bit shorter than the Lester cut, and I think that actually works to his advantage because it has a slightly quicker pace. Granted, the scenes between Lois and Clark are shorter, and they're different, of course. I think it works better because even though it was interesting to see a lot of the dialogue scenes between Lois and Clark in Lester's cut, I enjoyed watching them. It just seems that some of them dragged on a little bit too much, and I just preferred how they did it in Donner's cut, especially with one other difference. Maybe I don't know if I missed something, or it was just said briefly and I didn't catch it, but it just seems to me that Lois forgot what she said at the end of the previous film, and that's at the end of the first film. She first puts together, wait a minute, Clark and Superman are never around at the same time, could it? And in this film, she doesn't think about it again until Niagara Falls, which to me makes no sense. And that's another reason I prefer how it's done in Donner's cut, because it connects more with the ending of the first film. Because all the first few scenes involving Lois and Clark in that film, they all connect to the fact that she thinks that he might be Superman. You know, the scene where she takes the picture of him and then of Superman and then draws the Clark stuff over him and shows it to him, or she jumps out the window to try to prove it. And then, of course, the connecting scenes at Niagara Falls, and even there are scenes there, especially even more so how she discovers he is Superman and proves it. but getting a little bit more of a head there. It's just seems a little bit more natural in Donner's cut, but that's just me. As for how she discovers Clark as Superman, it's interesting to compare the two. You know, his hand in fire in the Lester cut, and then of course the whole shooting thing in Donner's cut. They're both interesting and interesting ideas. I prefer Donner's though, because two reasons. One, Lois doing that, even though some people might say it's a little out of character, with Kidder's version of Lois, it seems in character for me. And another thing is, like I mentioned in that review, it's a testament to how good of an actor Christopher Reeve was, especially as Superman, because he snapped out of Clark and into Kal-El like that. The only problem with that scene, though, is, of course, that was a test shot, and Donner never got to actually film it for real, so it's probably not the best it could have been, but it's forgivable under the circumstances, but it's an interesting scene to have in, especially considering that it wasn't a real gun, so Lois be trolling. Another thing I want to note is that there's a little bit more comedy in Lester's cut, and some of it's interesting, you know, like the ice cream hitting the guy in the face, and it's interesting, but like some of the comedy in Lester's follow-up, Superman 3, you could probably do without some of it. I mean, the dialogue stuff I don't mind, but it's like the situational comedy, it's like, okay, then that's when you notice the tones of the film, they're different, but it's only small stuff like that. It's not really like a big deal, like everyone's gonna go, whoa, 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 whoa. It's just one thing I noticed. This is another small difference I noticed, is that this is one that if you've watched both cuts enough, you'll notice it even more, is that you can notice a lot of different shots used and some alternate takes and stuff. One thing I really think they shouldn't, and one thing I really noticed was Superman's line when he confronts Zod for the first time. In the Donner cut, he says something about freedom of the press, and then of course in Lester's cut he says, "General, we should want to step outside." I think that line is a little bit more badass, but both of them are interesting. And the fight, for the most part, I didn't really notice any major differences. Maybe some like additional dialogue in Lester's, but like I said, it's a slightly longer film, and it kind of works more for his tone. One addition that was in the Lester cut that I think Donner should have kept in his cut was the fight at the Fortress of Solitude. I thought that was very interesting. So it has a little bit of comedy, but it's the type of comedy I think really works for this. It is kind of a shame that they cut it out, but I can understand why Donner did. But if this is one anything from Lester's cut I think should be kept in, it's that. And of course the ending where he returns to the top of the White House. That was an interesting scene. Now, of course, I will say I still prefer, even though you guys know I hate the whole turn back to the world thing, I prefer how Superman does that to change everything that's happened to the whole Kiss thing. Because you guys all know my thoughts on the Kiss. Why hasn't he done this before? He can stop every supervillain. You go up to Lex Luthor. Who the hell am I? You know that. I know Doug Walker did a better job of explaining why that power really is a stupid one than I probably could. Other than that, the only major differences I noticed were, like I said earlier, like scenes edited in different sequences. It's mostly when the film goes back and forth between Zod and Clark and Lois. Stuff is edited differently, and it's going to come down to personal taste whether you like it in one order or not. And me, it doesn't really matter because it's different cuts and stuff, and it's interesting. I do like some of the additional dialogue stuff in Lester's cut when Zod and all them are doing all the destruction stuff. It's interesting to see, like the arm wrestling thing was interesting. Why they cut that out, I don't know, but it's interesting because if you look at it in the Donner one, how Zod takes over the world, they're going with the less is more approach, where you can just infer what's happening. Because we all know Zod and his henchmen have the same powers as Superman, so it's easy to infer they're easily going to take over the world if Superman's not doing anything. But it's interesting in the Lesser cut to see all the additional stuff, like they add something to the Nod character, like him not being able to control his powers at first. That I think they should have kept in the Donner cut, but it doesn't bother me that they cut it out. It's just I think they should have kept it back in. But if there's one major thing that I could think of that I haven't talked about yet, it's the fact that Donner's cut has Marlon Brando's footage in it, and Lester's does not. They replace it, and you could tell when you watch both cuts back to back or side to side, you could notice where they cut the stuff and where they switch stuff and how they had to rearrange the dialogue and even get sound-alikes to change some dialogue. So it's a little bit obvious. And Also, because of no Marlon Brando, it creates a minor plot. I don't know if I'd say plot hole or inconsistency or like a what the WTF moment. And that is, how does Superman get his powers back? In the Donner cut, it's all fully explained. You know, the whole thing about the virtual Jor-El using the last of the power of the place to give Superman back his powers. Whereas in the Lester cut, all he does is pick up the green object, and the next time we see him, he has his powers back. So it's not really explained. And it's something that really should be explained. I mean, if you're going to explain how he loses his powers, you should explain how he gets them back. I mean, I know they couldn't use the Marlon Brando footage for obvious reasons, but if they're going to shoot scenes of Superman's mother talking to him, they could reshoot a scene of his mother talking. Or they could have gotten him, or they could have done what they did with the Hackman and got a Brando sound alike. Or they could have just reshot certain stuff to make it make more sense, but that's just me. Overall, though, the Lester cut, a very interesting cut, and like I said, which cut you prefer is going to come down to personal taste. I prefer Donner's cut, but that's not to say that Lester's cut is a bad film. I give it a 4 out of 5 stars because there's some minor stuff about it, you know, that keeps me from giving it a slightly higher score. But it is a very interesting cut, and even if you don't like one cut and you prefer, if for example, let's say you like the Donner cut but hate the Lester cut, or vice versa, it is interesting to watch both films back to back to see the differences in the cuts. And of course, like I said, with Donner cut, that's the closest we're going to get to see what you wanted. Now, before I finish this review, I'm going to talk about Lester and how he did the stuff. From what I understand, he had to actually shoot 51% of the movie in order to get credit as a director. And of course, from what I understand, 75% of the film had been done by the time Donner was kicked off. Now, I don't know if they just did one take of some of the footage and then used that take and interspliced it with other takes or something. I don't know the specifics of it. But one of the things I heard about that the producers were complaining to Donner about was the cost. I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is, why would you complain about that and have a guy reshoot a lot of it? That's going to cost more money. Now, adding sequences like the Paris one and stuff like that, spending the money on that I can understand because it wasn't shot yet. But what I would have done is I would have kept all of Donner's footage that he had shot in and then finished the rest of the movie. And then basically ghost direct the film. I mean, they did that once with a Hitchcock movie, but that wasn't because of the cost of the movie. It was because of his interactions with one of the stars. You know, get Hitchcock off set, stuff like that. I would have ghost directed the film, given the credit to Donner, and then all I would have asked for was a second unit credit. Because technically, if you think about it, that's what basically Lester would have been if he had done that. He would have been a glorified second unit director. But and again, that's just me. Lester, by that point, had directed some movies. I mean, he had directed The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, which, by the way, those two movies are why nowadays in the contracts for actors they actually have to have it written in stone how many movies are being made. Because apparently the actor signed up for one movie and they shot enough footage to edit 2 movies, and that kind of made them mad. You made 2 movies and we got paid for 1? He also directed Robin and Marianne and Butch and Sundance, the early days. I think those are the more popular ones. And then, of course, after this, Superman 3 directed The Return of the Musketeer. So Lester, I guess, did have a little bit of tenure at this time. So I guess that's why. I don't know if it was that or ego or something. Like, I'm going to take over Superman 2. Ha 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 ha. I don't know if it's that or whatever that made him want to go on the full-on directing credit, but if anything, they should have at least given Donner credit for second unit for the footage he did shoot, even if only a little bit of it was used in Lester's cut. But that's the studio for you. Anyway, like I said, 4 out of 5. And if you've only seen the original Superman movie and you haven't seen the Lester cut of Superman 2, or if you've only seen Donner's cut and have been hesitant to see it, I say give it a watch.